Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan, and welcome back to our latest edition of our Global Politics Show, our weekly show, where we look at international situations happening around the world and how they might affect us here in Ireland and at larger scale in terms of the European perspective as well. And up for discussion this week, well, what can we say? It's all over the news at the moment, the growing tensions in the Middle East. Are we at this case of an all-out war? Can it be prevented? Will diplomacy win out and trump out at the end of the day, dare I say? Or are we going to be looking at feet on the ground and, dare I say, an invasion, dare I say, which we all hope to avoid? Joining us today to discuss this matters and much more, we're delighted to be joined by an academic expert in Middle East politics and Iran's nuclear diplomacy, AZU academic Shirvin Zeinalzadeh. Shirvan, delighted to have you with us there today. And dare I say, we look at the word diplomacy, and we've seen that word used so many times in the past in the Middle East, and whether it be the administration of George Bush or the administration of Barack Obama, and now we're doing pigeons out there today with Donald Trump's announcement that he wants to give 2 more weeks to see if diplomacy might work. But we've always seen in the past that diplomacy has been a sort of a pigeonhole, has been mentioned and is mentioned, but dare I say, it's always led to action being followed, dare I say. Do you think this time in this certain conflict that diplomacy has a potential to win out over action?
Oh, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me on the show. I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak. You raised a very, very good point. The most brutal and open, honest answer to this is that war is the failure of diplomacy. So when we've reached this stage, unfortunately, we've seen that any attempts have so far not materialized in an ongoing resolution. However, I'm optimistic. There is still an opportunity for diplomacy to succeed, even though we have seen a hot conflict between Israel and Iran in particular. Diplomacy was working. It was actually doing rather well. Up until very recently, there were 5 rounds of talks between the United States and Iran, albeit brokered by Oman, who had kindly stepped in to mediate. And we were very much due for a 6th round of talks, which shows that discussion is possible. Now, the idea of diplomacy is that just sitting around a table is a victory within itself. As I said, we only usually go to war when diplomacy has failed. But I believe that this extension that Donald Trump has spoken about just today, about the extra 2 weeks, could be another sign that the carrot is still being dangled before the stick is used. Obviously, I'm a great believer in diplomacy. My background is in diplomacy itself, so I want to see diplomacy prevail. There are multiple actors that can get involved in diplomacy, and I think that Oman and Qatar and the UAE potentially still have a good role to play in mediating this. But what I want to see now is other substantial countries stepping up, working with the United States, working with Israel, working with Iran, and hoping to try and use their influence to mediate something. So, by this, I'm calling out the likes of China, Russia, and the European Union, who we mustn't forget are a very significant international global body that have a part to play in resolving this conflict before it gets any worse.
Shirvan, you mentioned an interesting point there. You mentioned Russia in that sort of statement. And people will look at this and say all this ongoing tension in the Middle East between Iran and Israel, it's deflecting what's going on at the moment. And it's probably a release for Vladimir Putin as well. Because before this, all eyes were on Russia, Ukraine, all the heat, the pressure that was coming on it. I know there's allegiances and ties there that go back between Iran and Russia. But so far, Russia have been quite enough, dare I say, in terms of what's going on here. And do you think maybe Russia sees this as an opportunity with all the world focusing on this now that they maybe can alleviate their sort of plans and make greater strides in their own battle that's going on at the moment. That this might be a deflection tactic be used by Putin to say, let's all the world focus on this now, and let's us make considerable gains here and Ukraine, where maybe when the eyes are not noticed on us there as much. Is Iran suffering based on that? Because it doesn't seem to be that Russia are sending out strong signals here that they're going to come to the aid of Iran.
You mentioned the key word. This is all about signaling. And at the moment, Russia, just yesterday, President Vladimir Putin stated that he had not yet received any indication from Iran that he would like some kind of assistance, that Iran was calling on Moscow for any assistance. Now, this is more than likely to be in a mediator role. The notion of deflecting the war, well, this is something that can be argued on a multifaceted front. Yes, there is still a terrible ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the international global bodies are still working on trying to appease that. It hasn't ended, even though we have seen another one started. Others have argued that the war with Iran now has deflected what's happening between Israel and Gaza. And as we've seen just recently, unfortunately, there was a fatal incident next to an aid center in which I believe 50 or 60 people were recently fatally wounded as well. So these conflicts are still going on, and they're still very much within the priorities of the greater, wider organizations that have to play a role in resolving them. So by this, I'm talking specifically about the United Nations Security Council, in which Russia is obviously a permanent member. So these discussions are still ongoing. It's unfortunate that another conflict has broken out, but this just goes to show that diplomacy is multilateral, conflict is multilateral, and with all actors involved having prominent roles within the UN, I think it's time for the UN as a body to step up as well and look at a global solution. And because the actors are there, they all should be learning from this rather unfortunate situation at the moment.
And what's England's key strategic point, and Starmer as government there in the UK as well? We know that they have multitudes of bases based around the Middle East in terms of strategic uh, key points or hot points, obviously, that the Israelis and the Americans would love to use and avail of in terms of that. So it's important that Britain holds strong in terms of their stance in diplomacy, because obviously that the Americans will be hoping that if they do decide, if Trump does decide to take decisive action and there, that he can count on Britain's aid, maybe with trade agreements, maybe to sweeten the sort of deal. But how important is it that Starmer, if the UK is united with the United Nations to preach diplomacy, that he holds firm in terms of that and does not let Britain get involved or let America use the naval bases or the key strategic points that Britain have, which we know could be cause detrimental damage in the Middle East.
Well, yeah, the Prime Minister has repeatedly called for de-escalation when it comes to this conflict between Iran and Israel. And so far, as we've seen, the United Kingdom have not acted in providing any kind of resources or materials to Israel to defend against Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, if we look back to last October, then the UK did play a significant part when there was an initial exchange of fire between Israel and Iran. British fighter jets were deployed from Cyprus to assist in the interception of Iranian drones that were sent from Tehran towards Tel Aviv. This time they've stayed back. So we have to ask ourselves the question as to why. Obviously, I think the UK has learned its lessons from the past, particularly when it was the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq, the so-called weapons of mass destruction that were never there. It could be that the domestic audiences in the UK are pressuring the government to stay well away from this conflict because of those lessons of the past, because of the fact that the United Kingdom, now a sole actor in Europe, away from the European Union, can ill afford financially to embroil itself in another conflict, could also be another reason. But also, I think the UK, again, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, also potentially sees an opportunity to act as some kind of mediator or some kind of buffer between the two. However, we know that the United Kingdom recently sanctioned two major government members of Israel, which has kind of left a bitter taste between Tel Aviv and London. So it's interesting to see how that relationship between London and Tel Aviv pans out, let alone how the UK can act in kind of resolving this conflict between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, and Shirvan, we always mention about Iran and the proxies associated with like Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic, the Houthis there in Yemen, the sort of Hamas as well. And do you think maybe Israel waited and held out until all these sort of proxies were at their lowest in ebbs in terms of the lowest and lowest in terms of reinforcement in terms of troops before acting like they did? If you think if Hamas or Hezbollah were that bit stronger or not decimated that they were, do you think Israel would have acted out even still, or do you think they sort of said, let's make sure all these players, these proxies that Iran are so closely associated to, let's have them all at their lowest ebb, but basically not surviving, dare I say, before we act?
This is not a conflict that started overnight. For decades, Tel Aviv has been accusing Tehran of pursuing a nuclear program. We've seen that from since the early 90s, Benjamin Netanyahu has been raising this, stating on numerous occasions that within 6 months, within a year, within weeks, within days, Iran would be a nuclear power. What we've seen in terms of the proxies is, I believe that this is part of the grand strategy by Israel. There was obviously a much greater risk to the state of Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas still being dominant after the October the 7th incident in which Hamas uh, invaded Israel and this incident took place. It was a justification for Israel to act rather heavily towards Hamas, which they did. We've seen as well that Hezbollah have also been essentially reduced from their former power. So it did open the doors for Israel to continue their long-term strategy towards Iran. I think that if they were still very active and if they still had the potential, then we wouldn't see such a conflict going now because it would have been too much for Israel on all fronts to face Hezbollah, Hamas, to some extent the Houthis and Iran as well.
Yeah, and in terms of, we always heard that this was a aerial strike. It was a key strategic plan, a military plan to take out all the nuclear sites, the possibility of enrichment throughout Iran as well. But we have seen in the past week or so, we saw the massive devastation on the media, the TV studios in terms of Iran, in terms of, and people will look at that and they'll frown at it in the Western world because that's an attack on press, that's an attack on media. I know there might be sort of ties, but that doesn't have any capabilities of nuclear enrichment. That doesn't have any capabilities of nuclear sites in terms of that. So is it a case now that maybe that Israel have strayed away from their initial plan and they're now making key strategic moves that are, dare I say, hitting the heart of the regime of Iran as well? It's not solely focused on nuclear or eradicating any nuclear sites, but now they're saying what are key militant posts, what are key propaganda strikes, and let's eliminate them as well, which we're looking on in Europe with growing concern as well. Israel preached this one message, and now they seems to be taking another direction as well.
Yes, I think it's fair to point out that the hitting of the Iranian state television broadcasting center was a a move that does not align to the genuine goal of removing Iran's nuclear threat. However, this is a war of information as well. In fact, one of the key reasons that states go to war, according to a Professor James Fearon, in his paper from 1995 called The Rationalist Explanation for War, he suggests that private information is one of the reasons that states go to war. Israel are claiming that the uh, Iranian Broadcasting Center was also being used for dual purposes for military planning. I Again, I am not privy to any of that kind of information, and this private information that's kind of basing these decisions is something that only the Israelis should be able to justify. Um, but I agree, this is very much a tactic that's away from the initial plan of action to reduce Iran's nuclear program. And Iran have quite rightly and condemned the act that has taken place, as have many of the global kind of partners and states around the world that have seen this as a stray from the original mission, and it's been condemned.
And sure, Van, maybe penultimate question, second last question before I let you go. We look at the geography of Iran now, and we've seen past wars in the Middle East. We know Afghanistan is a big enough country. We know Iraq, but this Iran is probably the 17th largest country in the world. We know Tehran has a population of 9.7 million, which is the same as the entire country of Israel, but the whole population of Iran stretches over as far as 90 million in terms of that. It's the sixth largest country in Asia in terms of that. Can we afford, or can the world afford a ground scale invasion to take place in Iran? And if that does, the worst case scenario does, is that going to affect a global recession to come in the years to come by? Because we know about the oil industry in terms of that, but this is such a massive country in terms of size and the scale that you cannot expect to put feet on the ground here and expect to win a war here in 3 or 4 years, given the massive scale of this country. Because 90 million, I suppose, I know the death toll is quite high in Iran at the moment, given everything, but it's still a drop in the ocean when we consider the figures that were there, and we don't want to. Obviously, keep passing to everyone that's lost their life, but just giving the size and the scale of this country.
Well, first and foremost, I think I will put my neck on the line and say any notion of a ground invasion are absolutely impossible. We have moved on from the last time Iran was invaded, which was in 1980 during the Iran-Iraq War. We were looking at third generation warfare tactics in those days where there were still trenches dug, there were still boots on the ground. In this day and age, technology has progressed in such a way that we are essentially looking at fifth generation warfare, which is taking place in the skies through missiles, through drones, and through very advanced combat aircraft. So it's not feasible for an invasion of Iran based on the technology that's being used. In fact, Israel doesn't even share a border with Iran. So logistically, how would Israel be able to do this? Would it involve a coalition? Again, how would that happen? Because at the moment, nobody wants to see boots on the ground. I think that's the red line for the United States and for everyone else. They do not want to see their soldiers as Trump defined it, as an endless war with feet on the ground. We've seen how Americans have, and Russians, in fact, have dealt with the situation in Afghanistan. We've seen how it worked out in Iraq, and we've seen how wars have worked out in other places. It's not going to happen. That's my genuine belief. In terms of the size of Iran, you're quite right. It's a very, very large, diverse kind of geography. You forget that Iran is not just a desert. It has lush forests,
Continent,
it
yeah.
has mountains. It has two access to seas and waterways. So it's a very, very complex situation. This war will not be fought on the ground. I really don't believe it. The population of Iran is also very diverse. It's not just Persians. There are ethnic Turks. There are Azeris. There are ethnic Arabs. There are Baluch. It's such a wide population given the size of the country. So it again, I reiterate, I don't think a ground invasion is feasible.
Yeah, and lastly, Shirvan, in terms of the humanitarian situation now, in terms of Iran and obviously finances and economy, and we know that so long we're talking to Americans saying another 2 weeks, so that's probably another 2 weeks of continuous airstrikes in terms of that. The people on the streets of Iran, on the Tehran and places like that, we know people are leaving the capital under droves day by day, but how long can the regime Iran afford to feed its people in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the whole economy sort of breaking down? We know the Ayatollah, we know Iran and the natural resources depot are probably quite rich, but obviously as the days go by, the affordability of this, is there a growing concern that if this keeps going on, we could have a humanitarian crisis in Iran, dare I say?
Well, with all due respect, this has been going on for years, not simply because Israel has started a war. Iran has been under very strict global economic sanctions for many, many years. And Iran has prided itself on resilience, self-sufficiency, and it's something that the Iranian people have become very resilient and used to. So this is an ongoing situation. Yes, in terms of a humanitarian issue, I think the notion of evacuating a city of 10 million people is not reasonable. I've asked the question as to why would President Trump ask for this to happen? Is it because there's a threat to life, or is it because there was an intention to sow some kind of discord between the people of Iran and the government of Iran? At the moment, that remains to be seen. But in terms of humanitarian welfare, Iran is a very diverse country. It enjoys the local production of all of the staples it needs. Can it go on forever? Absolutely not. We know that eventually everything has a finite kind of date. But in terms of the way things are going, Iran is self-sufficient for the moment. What I am concerned about, though, is the wider impact of this. Should this conflict escalate to something more than it is now, we're then looking at a global fallout from this, particularly because 25% of the oil passes through the Persian Gulf, as well as a key shipping route between East Asia, West Asia, and Europe via Dubai, again passing through that major waterway. So if this conflict does escalate, there is potential for the knock-on effect to impact the global kind of logistics supply, and then we will see the whole world kind of looking at how resources are being affected, how supplies are being affected. So this is not just Iran. This is potentially a much wider situation.
On that note, all we have to say is Shirvan Zeinalzadeh, thanks for joining us this evening on the Global Politics Show. An AZU academic expert in Middle East politics and Iran nuclear diplomacy. Thanks for sharing your views, and as always, we hope diplomacy wins out at the end of the day. But from me, Jim Conlan, to you, Shirvan Zeinalzadeh, stay safe, take care, and God bless.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me.